Hi, I'm Jennifer Isabella.
And I'm Dane Anderson.
Your co-host for Forrester's podcast, What It Means, where we explore the latest market dynamics impacting executives and their customers. Today, we're joined by Principal Analysts Michael O'Grady and Sam Higgins to discuss how automation will impact the future of jobs in the APAC region. Welcome both.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here from me too.
So, Michael, we had you on a little earlier this year to talk about the impact of automation on jobs in Europe. So before we dig into our APAC findings, can you tell us a little bit about, the trends that are different in these two regions to kind of level set us?
Yeah, so we're using the same framework, which is a sort of version of Frey and Osborne, but we're calibrating it with respect to lots of external data sources as well. But for the first time, we're applying it to the APAC region. Now, the APAC region is very different from Europe, very different from North America, for a number of different reasons. One is GDP per worker, GDP per capita is very different. And automation is linked to the amount of investment you've got. You might want to invest to complement a worker, reduce the worker costs, or move the worker to a more productive task. So automation is good for that, but it's also driven, therefore, by GDP per worker. High GDP per worker means you're more likely to want to do that. So that's one aspect. The second aspect as well is just the demographics. We've got Japan that has an average working age of 49, and they're going to lose a lot of workers through natural retirement over the next 20 years, and we've integrated that into the model. So that's another reason why you might want to automate, because if you want to maintain your standard of living, your GDP growth, and you've got fewer workers, then you've got to be more productive, and automation is one way to do that. And maybe a third reason as well is just the share of the economy that is dedicated to services, or in fact to industry compared to services. When we looked at Europe, there was about 75 to 80% of the GDP was dedicated to services. When we look at India, when we look at China, that's not the case. We've got a much stronger industry component. And in fact, just taking India, for example, 43 or so % of their GDP comes from agriculture. So a lot of these tasks are highly automatable in theory. It doesn't mean we're going to automate, because as I said before, you need a motivation to automate, and you need to be able to automate. And the motivation can be cost savings. And you're not necessarily going to be looking to automate if you've got an excess of low-cost labor, for example, right? So I would say there's a lot of very interesting work that we did with Sam about, triangulating, comparing, contrasting. And I thought that was really useful. Sam, have I covered some of the things we talked about when we created the forecast?
Yeah, you have, Michael, and I think you're right. What's really interesting is there is a sort of homogenous view in some respects across the European Union. There's a lot of commonality of standards. There's a lot of commonality of how they think about labour, how labour interacts between the different countries within the European Union, that you don't necessarily see in APAC either. It's we often talk about sort of Asia Pacific is not a country. It's a very diverse region, and as Michael rightly points out, we have this sort of tale of different perspectives. Australia, as Michael was talking about, the Indian example there being quite heavily agriculture. China, we see a lot of manufacturing. Australia, it's nearly 90% of Australia's economy that's actually made up of services. So it's a very different story here than it is necessarily in India and China. And then those demographic elements that Michael spoke about as well become really important. Those age differences, even things like just where we source labour from. If you think about countries like Australia, where birth rates aren't necessarily that high, where we don't have a young population, not the oldest population in the region by any stretch, but definitely up there. We're very reliant on migration, and so that's been a real challenge economically through the last 2 years. And so that's another factor now forcing people to think about, well, how do we close the gap between the work that needs to be done, the labor that we have available at the right age with the right skills.
And knowing that APAC is not a country, to your point, Sam, what markets specifically are we referring to in this research?
So we're looking at India, China, South Korea, Japan, and Australia. So they're the 5 countries. And in fact, each country's got a different dynamic. So we've integrated those dynamics into the model. Although we've got one model to try and capture it all, each country's got its own set of parameters that drive things. So just coming back on what Sam said, for example, we found that 12% of jobs, not counting new jobs that will be created, will be lost in Australia, which is a similar level of job loss to the US. Because the US, likewise, like Sam said, has got a high level of services, and it's also got a high GDP per capita or GDP per worker. So when you've got the same factors driving a country, then you get the same sort of results. But Australia, that's where it ends, really. I think the other countries in the 5 countries we looked at are very different from North America or from Europe.
So Michael and Sam, so Asia Pacific is interesting, right? It's perhaps more diverse than Europe, and a lot has been written about Japan and the declining birth rate, and of course China as well. Whereas in a market like India, you still have strong population growth. So can you talk a little bit about how those impacts manifest themselves in our model and what we're predicting?
Yeah, well, one of the most astounding facts that came from this was that over the next 20 years, India will have another 160 million workers that they've got to cater for. They've got a very young workforce, and they're going to get more workers. So they're actually going to overtake China in terms of the number of workers available over in that time period. So then it becomes something quite interesting, right? Why do you want to automate? What is the purpose of automation? And if you're displacing people who are looking for jobs, then maybe that's not going to work, right? So that was one of the big things that came out. You can look at GDP per capita, sure, but you also got to look at the growth of the working population. And like Sam was saying, Australia will have through people coming from other countries, they're going to have a growth in working populations. And so then it becomes a question of how do you manage the automation when certain working populations are declining, when there's a massive incentive to automate because you've got less workers, and then you've got other types of drivers when you've got still a big increase in working populations. And actually, there's one thing that I was very intrigued with in this, and it doesn't necessarily appear in the report. It's that everything doesn't always translate into an automation solution. So when we look at India, for example, India are seeing a massive growth in the gig economy. And the latest report I saw is that maybe 1% of their workforce will be in the gig economy. By 2030, it might be 4% of the workforce. So, what we're seeing is it's not automation per se, but we're seeing technology change the way people find jobs. And the other thing about that is, and they are connected. Automation is one of the stages in technology helping workers. But the gig economy I find fascinating because when you become a gig worker, you automatically have access to a contract, to benefits, things that maybe aren't available. I mean, in India, for example, the informal economy is huge. It's more than 90% of the workers. And so the gig economy, I know it doesn't quite map onto automation, but I found that absolutely fascinating.
I'd add to that, Michael, in that I think those sorts of observations are really important for decision makers, because we often do tend to focus in on the robot question, this fundamental existential, idea that's been born out from, certainly all the science fiction I read as a kid. But the real message here, I think, for decision makers is, what are the forces that are transforming the labor force? what is, as as the title of our reports suggest, what is the future of jobs? How do you think about the interplay, as Michael said, between these emerging technologies of AI and automation relative to the changing nature of the workforce, both from a demographic perspective, from the way in which that technology is employed, and even the psychology. The other fascinating thing, again, something that isn't in the report, but is certainly part of Forrester's broader research thinking, is the readiness people have and the readiness of organizations to adopt some of these technologies. And so, our work around this idea of a robotics quotient, an ability to measure, like we do IQ and EQ, how prepared people are psychologically and emotionally to participate in these different arrangements, be they using technology and working in the gig environment, as Michael describes, or augmenting what they do on a day-to-day basis for increased decision-making capacity, for better planning, for a safer environment. That's one of the challenges, I think, certainly facing India. On one hand, they've got this big agricultural base that needs to be reformed for safety reasons and other reasons, economic as well, but certainly safety elements. And there's been a lot of pushback on that. So in some respects, there's a lost opportunity there for that part of their economy to get benefits from these technologies that might not be really, as Michael said, about directly automating away effort, but using automation in a different way to improve people's overall standards of living, or the satisfaction that they might have, or their job prospects more broadly.
Are there other trends in the region that you're seeing that would impact workers and jobs, broader trends that cut across the countries?
I think there are probably two we picked up on. One was really around the role of education and where that stands in the various economies, both from a gender perspective as well as a focus. So, are STEM subjects, for example, being picked up at the rates at which they need to because of the demand that we're going to see in jobs that are harder to automate. So a great example of that is the sort of scientific and technological roles that we know will grow in Australia, but we just don't have the right educational processes in place at the moment to get the number of STEM graduates out the door, and particularly low levels of women picking STEM subjects in Australia is another example. So I think there's an education piece here. And then the other one, Michael, would be the green economy, which I know you spent a bit of time looking at the impact of that, as a whole new trend, if you like, for where demand for jobs might come from.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And one of the things we did this time when we updated the forecast is we added new jobs, like we did in North America, like we did in Europe, because what we can't do is just estimate the number of jobs that might be at risk from automation or lost to automation without understanding that new jobs will come along. We need to project ourselves into 2030 or 2040 and say these jobs didn't exist before, but they do now. So that's the idea behind it. And we looked at the Climate Paris Agreement, we looked at the South Korea Green New Deal, and we looked at, we distributed the jobs according to where those job vacancies are likely to be in the green economy. Now, what we do know from research is that 40% of the renewables, solar panels, for example, are made in China. So Asia's quite a strong contributor to that job market. We've got an idea of 30 million or so jobs that will be created from these reports. And so we are dishing out where those jobs will be created based on the opportunities. The other thing I would say, just to add to something that I've been very passionate about for quite a number of years, I had the opportunity recently to model CO2 emissions to 2050. And I wrote a sort of internal memorandum on that. And what we found was that the three biggest emitting countries are China, which is about a third of CO2 emissions. Then you've got the US, and then you've got India. And over the next 20 years, India will probably overtake the US, right? So there's also a sort of closed loop around this as well, is that if APAC are a key contributor towards renewables, the green economy, then it also helps them solve that problem, because that is where a lot of the emissions are coming from because of their large populations. So I think that's an important point to take on board when we create our forecasts. One other point I would say, following this work, I also had a chance to look at AI developments across China, India, and various other places. And what I was able to find really was that AI is adopted by large corporations quite freely, but for small and medium corporations, it's a lot harder. So when you look at the job that you might be losing to automation in the future, you can't just assume that that's going to be coming from large corporations. You have to assume that it's across the board. And so that's the technological challenge that we've got facing us. And that's why a lot of the numbers that we've come up with are a little bit less than Frey and Osborne study that they did in the US and such like, because we're aware of the challenges from, it's not just because something can be automated that you automate it. It depends on having an industrial solution that works. And that a lot of the time in the future will depend, as we are a service economy, depend on good AI solutions. And again, not just in large corporations, but in SMEs as well. So I would say there's some of the factors that we took in board when we were creating the model that were important.
So can you talk more specifically about how many jobs in APAC will be lost to automation based on our forecast, and which countries and industries will be the most impacted?
It's about 4% or so of the jobs by 2040. And if you compare that to the US is more like 12%. If you compare it to Europe, Europe's more like 9%, right? So you can see straight away this GDP per capita, the fact that different drivers happen, in APAC compared to North America and Europe. That's an important part. Now, in terms of where it's actually happening, well, I suppose you might be able to guess in a sense, because 93% of the population in these 5 countries comes from China and India. And as China has got a large GDP per capita compared to India, then about 80% actually of the jobs that will be lost will be in China. So 63 million sounds a lot, but it's not really a lot. And because of the size of their workforce, the working populations, the majority of those will be in China. Now, when we look at Frey and Osborne, again, going back to the model framework, what we find was that there'll be lower growth in jobs that are more automatable. So this is things like industry, construction, agriculture, forestry, and fishing, and professional services will see faster growth, for example. So when we apply this logic, what we find is industry, agriculture, forestry, and fishing, construction, they've got a larger automation potential, so they're more likely to lose jobs to automation. So when we put all that together, what we find is that industry will be about 15 million of the jobs that will be lost. Agriculture will be about 9 million of the jobs that will be lost. Professional service will not see much change. Public administration, again, won't see as big job losses. So again, it's all of the industries that have got a high automation potential. So they're some of the industries, and obviously retail, wholesale, some of the tourist industries. Again, there's a high potential to automate or to optimize those. So again, using the Frey and Osborne model, we found that those would also be heavily impacted. In terms of jobs creation, so a lot of the green economy, they map onto the construction, buildings, green buildings. And so we are going to see an increase in that. And obviously, we're going to see an increase in the jobs in the energy sector. Again, not because they're less automatable, it's just that there are new jobs coming along in the green energy sector that need to be taken on board.
There's some interesting impacts as well by proportion at the country level as well, right, Michael? We've, as you say, the volumes when you count them as individual jobs is quite large when we think of China and India. But as a portion of the labour force, it's Australia and South Korea that are actually going to be impacted the most in terms of net job losses, correct?
That's right, and for different reasons, actually. So Australia is a bit like the US, high GB per capita, similar types of share from professional services. So again, same logic, same type of result. South Korea is a little bit different because the share of its industry that is dedicated, of its gross value added that's dedicated to industry is quite high. It's higher than Japan. And so these are more automatable. These are jobs that are more automatable. And so they're going to lose jobs both because of the demographic issue, unlike Australia, where they're going to gain workers, and they're going to lose jobs as well because the types of industry that people are going to be working on in South Korea are more industry focused. So in other words, susceptible to automation. So when you combine that, you find that the biggest job losses are going to be not counting the new jobs created, are going to be in Australia, are going to be in South Korea. In fact, yes, indeed.
The other thing, Michael, in my mind that we haven't discussed, but I think it would be interesting maybe to talk about it today, is just the constraint that we've seen in the last sort of 6 to 8 months on the labour markets in Japan and Australia as well, both exhibiting some of the highest labour shortages in the OECD. What, if anything, do you think that will do when we come to look at this forecast again in the next 6 to 8 months? Is this labour shortage that we see as part of this economic uncertainty and hesitancy in migration and just even inefficiencies in migration processes between countries at the moment going to make some of these forecasts better or worse in our minds?
It means your working population is not going to grow, and you're still going to have a similar high automation potential score. You're still going to lose maybe 12% of jobs lost to automation. And so that then creates an issue, right? So how do you have to change the way you automate so that you are more harmonious with the workforce, maybe, if there's less workers? A bit like in Japan, right? I mean, in Japan, there's no, you can't create efficiencies by recruiting more people because most people in Japan, there's very low unemployment in Japan. And so you can't sort of say, oh, those people who are not working, they can come and work. And then that'll, it's purposely such that the most of the people, the working populations are actually working. So the labor market in Japan is very tight. And that means if you want to train people in automation, you've got to take it from the existing workforce a lot of the time. And so you've got this whole new migration of the workforce. How do you train them? How do you teach them? How do you create a harmony with the robot? How do you make sure that it's not robots against humans and things like that? So I think it is a really interesting question, that, Sam, indeed.
And Michael and Sam, for the last 70 years, manufacturing for the world has taken place in Asia Pacific, right? It's Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, China, and that was generally because of lower cost labor. So as manufacturing is increasingly automated, does that change? Does the incentive to manufacture in Asia Pacific for the rest of the world diminish? And in fact, do we see more automation and manufacturing taking place in source countries in the largest markets? Did we make any assumptions on a shift of that sort?
One thing for sure is going to be, with the trade wars that we're seeing, you're more likely to see a distribution of where you're installing your workers. So you're not going to be based in one country, you might spread them over multiple countries. I think that is the case. I do think politically, it's quite nice to be able to say we are repatriating our workers and creating our own industry again. I think there might be a gap between the political niceties of saying that and the reality, however. So at the moment, we've not been able to find any data that was conclusive. And even if you look at pharmaceutical industries and things like that, which have got a very high price point a lot of the time, you don't necessarily see that, that they're going to stop using Asia Pacific as a country where they manufacture the goods. So I think a lot of it depends, but at the moment it's still wait and see, I would say.
I think it's interesting the sort of self-sufficiency and sovereign capacity question, I think, comes up in a lot of domains. It comes up in the manufacturing domain. It comes up in, cloud computing domains. It comes up in a number of different places. And I do agree with Michael. I think there is some political mileage to be gained from some of that. I think what is interesting in that question, Dane, is whether there is a shift in the perception of it that Asia Pacific has of itself in regards to its role in the overall global economy, and its role amongst each other. So, we mentioned at the top of the podcast that, we don't think of Asia Pacific as a country, but increasingly what we're seeing is behaviors within the region that do mimic some of what we see in modern Europe. So if we think of the recent regional economic cooperation partnership that's been signed across the region, if we look at the use of things like central bank digital currencies to try and reduce the amount of friction in trade, there's some other interesting factors, maybe beyond just where the manufacturing happens and more about whether Asia Pacific is stepping up in a way that many people predicted at the turn of the last century to make its mark on the global stage economically, socially, and presumably in some elements politically.
Well, what's interesting in your answers as I thought more about it is that the question assumes a Western-based dominance, right? In fact, for many markets, Asia Pacific will be the largest market, and therefore it will make sense for this to be a key source of manufacturing. So already today, China is the biggest auto market in the world, it's the biggest energy market in the world, and that's just China, right? So there will still be an incentive here for that manufacturing capacity, even if it more of it redistributes to Europe or North America. But yeah, so I think we made a wise choice not to make too bold of a choice on the assumption, right? Because that example I just gave is why we don't do that, because it assumes a certain type of stasis and conditions, which we can't necessarily predict to be the case in 20 years from now.
So knowing that we're in the thick of planning season, I assume that data of this ilk is a really powerful tool as an input into executive planning and planning for, teams and your workforce. Can you leave us with maybe a nugget, a piece of guidance that you give clients as they take a look at this data in the context of their own situation?
So, Jen, you're right. This while this is sort of macroeconomic in the way it's presented, the intention with these forecasts over the many years we've been doing them, and the great evolution that's come through Michael's continued work in this space, is to be able to then map these changes onto individual industries, individual workforces, and ultimately individual organizations, so that we can start to do that preparation from a skills perspective, from a structural perspective, and not find ourselves caught short like many of us have been recently in regards to, the availability or not of labor. And, and to also put a bit of reality around, what is actually possible and what's really happening with automation. So to Michael's point earlier, to remove some of the fear and uncertainty and doubt that can be created by these conversations that are typically one-sided around the loss of jobs, when, as Michael rightly put it, there is a deficit but also a dividend through automation strategies, and organizations need to understand both sides of that equation as they plan out their workforce and adoption of these technologies. And so that's really how we expect people to use it, is bring it home, bring it down into your workforce planning, put it alongside those other planning activities. As you said, at this time of year, great time to think about it, and just plan that out. Typically, workforce planning will occur with a view of 1 to 5 years out. We're obviously going a bit further with our forecasts. We want to be able to see what that looks like at a longer term. But that would be my recommendation.
Yeah, and I would follow that up as well. I think you automate to save costs, or you automate to compensate for workers that a declining workforce, or you don't automate if you've got an excess of people wanting to find jobs, right? So it's about balancing what needs to be done in the future with the trends we're seeing over the next 20 years. And so this provides you a really good insight into what those trends might look like. I mean, if you've got 35% of your workforce retiring over the next 20 years, then you need to seriously think about automation. You need to seriously think about how this can, or it needs to become an essential part of your planning process. And you also need to understand which types of industries, which types of jobs are more likely to be automated, and how do you start doing that? What types of solutions are out there? It's not something for 20 years planning, it's something for now, because these things are, as you can see in the changes to the forecast, these things are happening quite quickly. So I would say understand why you need to automate and take good time to do it, and do it well, I would say.
Great. Thank you both for joining us today.
It was great. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you both.
If you like what you heard today, subscribe to Forrester's What It Means podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or your favorite podcast player. To continue the conversation, follow Forrester on Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn, or drop us a note at podcast@forrester.com. Thanks for listening.